Harlem, New York, on a Thursday morning in November, while the rest of New York City slipped off their Thanksgiving preparations, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked out of a black Cadillac in front of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, wearing a camel hair overcoat that cost more than most Harlem families earn in 6 months, a fedora tilted just slightly to the left, and carrying a Cuban cigar that he lit slowly while surveying the line of people that stretched 6 city blocks. These weren't customers coming to place policy bets or debtors coming to pay what they owed. These were mothers with children bundled against the November cold, elderly men and women who'd been waiting since before dawn in temperatures that hovered just above freezing, working families whose paychecks never quite stretched far enough to cover both rent and food. All of them waiting for the moment when Harlem's most feared gangster would personally hand them a 20 pounds frozen turkey, canned goods, fresh vegetables, pies, and in many cases, envelopes containing cash that would keep their electricity on or prevent their eviction, or buy medicine their children desperately needed. Johnson took a long drag from his cigar, exhaled smoke into the cold morning air, and nodded to his men. The distribution began, and for the next hours, the criminal who has been arrested many times, who runs a gambling empire, who controls narcotics distribution through Harlem, who has killed men with his own hands and ordered the deaths of dozens more, stood in the freezing cold, personally greeting every family that came through the line, shaking hands with men who gambled away their paychecks in his policy banks, hugging them, and whose sons he employed as runners and collectors, kissing children who would grow up to either work for him or fight against him, treating each recipient not as a charity case, but as a neighbor, as family, as someone entitled to dignity, and a real Thanksgiving dinner, even if they couldn't afford to buy one themselves. By the time the last turkey was distributed, Johnson had then away thousands of turkeys, tens of thousands in canned goods and fresh produce, and more in direct cash payments to families facing particular hardship. Total number of people fed, approximately 10. 0. Total number of arrest warrants executed against Johnson for this massive criminal operation funding community charity, 0. Because even the police standing across the street watching the entire spectacle understood that arresting a man for feeding the poor would trigger riots. This was one of Johnson's many years conducting the Thanksgiving distribution. He started with turkeys purchased, with his first substantial policy gambling profits back when he was just another young hustler trying to make his mark in Harlem's underworld. The operation had grown methodically over the year. Johnson's financial manager began planning each October, coordinating with Harlem ministers to identify struggling families, purchasing turkeys wholesale, ordering pies from local bakeries to support legitimate Harlem businesses, arranging refrigerated trucks, and setting up distribution tents with precision. Now, decades after that first modest giveaway, Johnson had become the undisputed king of Harlem, the man who survived attempts to take over, who spent a decade in Alcatraz and came back stronger, who sits at the same table with other crime figures negotiating how to divide New York's criminal territories, and who every Thanksgiving transforms himself from gangster into something Harlem has far less of than criminals, a man who actually gives a damn what her poor people eat. The scene was extraordinary, not just for its scale, but for its brazenness. Johnson wasn't hiding. He wasn't operating through intermediaries. He was standing in the open on Harlem's busy street in broad daylight, with news photographers taking pictures and reporters conducting interviews, personally handing out food purchased with money that everyone knew came from illegal gambling, surrounded by bodyguards who were themselves wanted by police, operating a distribution system more efficient than any government welfare program and more generous than any church charity, demonstrating once again the fundamental paradox that has made Bumpy Johnson simultaneously Harlem's most wanted criminal and its most untouchable citizen. The money he takes from the community through gambling comes back to the community through charity. The man who profits from vice also prevents starvation, and the gangster the police have spent decades trying to imprison is protected, not by guns or corruption, but by the simple fact that thousands of Harlem residents ate Thanksgiving dinner because he decided they should. Margaret Washington, a widow who lives on a small Social Security payment, waited in line for hours to receive her turkey. When she finally reached the distribution table where Johnson stood, she grabbed his hand with both of hers and held on tight. "Mr. Johnson, God bless you. I live on very little after I pay my rent. Without this turkey, without this food you're giving me, I don't eat is weak. The welfare office says I make too much to qualify for assistance, but you don't ask how much I make, you just give. You're a better man than all those politicians and social workers who are supposed to help people like me." Johnson handed her the turkey, added extra cans of vegetables, pulled an envelope from his coat pocket containing cash, and said quietly, "Mrs. Washington, you take is, you pay your rent, you keep your lights on, you buy yourself something nice. Don't tell anybody I gave it to you, and don't thank me. You're a Harlem woman. You deserve to eat on Thanksgiving. That's all there is to it." Mrs. Washington started crying, tried to return the money, but Johnson closed her fingers around the envelope and called to one of his men to help her carry her food home. Robert Jackson stood in line, a steel worker who'd been laid off and hadn't found work since his unemployment benefits ran out. His wife cleans houses for little money, they're behind on rent, and facing eviction. Their children have been eating beans and rice for dinner every night because that's all the family can afford. Jackson watched Johnson hand Mrs. Washington that envelope of cash and wondered if maybe Johnson might help his family, too. When Jackson reached the front of the line, Johnson looked at him for a long moment. "You work the steel yards?" Johnson asked. Jackson nodded. "Got laid off months ago. Been looking for work ever since." "Nothing out there." Johnson handed him the turkey, then started adding extra food to Jackson's pile. Extra cans, extra produce to pies instead of one. "You got kids?" Johnson asked. "4," Jackson said. Johnson called over his financial manager. "What have we got left for special cases?" After consulting the numbers, Johnson nodded. "Give Mr. Jackson money, write down his name and address. I want someone checking on him in 2 weeks to see if he found work. If he hasn't, we'll help." Again, he turned back to Jackson. "You take that money, you pay your rent, you feed your family, you don't owe me nothing. You're a working man who hit bad luck. That's not your fault. You'll find work soon, and when you do, you remember that Bumpy Johnson helped you when nobody else would. That's all I ask." Jackson took the envelope with shaking hands, tried to thank Johnson, couldn't find words, just said they're holding money that would keep his family from being thrown into the street, holding food that would give his children their first real meal in months, and crying. This happened many times. Johnson identifying families in particular distress and providing extra assistance that went beyond the standard distribution, pulling money from his own pocket or directing his manager to make additional payments, treating his criminal fortune as a resource that existed not just to make him wealthy, but to prevent the absolute worst hardships that poverty inflicts on families. Further back in the line, Gloria Mendez waited with her infant daughter wrapped in blankets against the cold. Her husband was in prison, leaving Gloria alone with a baby and little income. "I never asked for charity in my life," she told the woman standing next to her in line. "But I heard Mr. Johnson was giving out cash to mothers with children. I don't care if he's a criminal right now. He's the only person offering to help." When Gloria reached Johnson, he took one look at the baby, called his manager over, and without even asking Gloria about her circumstances, handed her a turkey, double the standard food package, and an envelope containing cash. "You got a baby there," Johnson said simply. "Babies need formula. diapers, medicine. This should help. You need more, you come see me personally. Don't go through my people, you come straight to me. Understand? Gloria nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Across the street, an NYPD captain stood with other officers watching the distribution and feeling the particular frustration that comes from knowing you're witnessing criminal activity, but being powerless to do anything about it. The captain, has spent years trying to arrest Bumpy Johnson on charges that will stick. He's personally arrested Johnson multiple times. Every case has been dismissed. Witnesses refuse to testify, evidence disappears, and now he stands here watching Johnson operate completely in the open, distributing food purchased with money he knows comes from illegal gambling, surrounded by known criminals, and there's nothing he can do except watch and understand that if he tried to arrest Johnson right now in front of thousands of Harlem residents who've just received food from Johnson's generosity, the neighborhood would explode into violence. A reporter approached the captain, asked him why police weren't intervening. The captain's response was pure frustrated honesty. What do you want me to do? Arrest him for giving away turkeys. Shut down a food distribution that's feeding thousands of people who'd otherwise go hungry. We'd look like monsters. Every newspaper in the city would crucify us. The mayor would have my badge. And for what? Johnson is smarter than that. He's created a situation where arresting him would be worse than letting him operate. He's turned Char into armor that makes him untouchable. It makes me sick, but there's nothing I can do about it today, the reporter pressed. But isn't there something deeply wrong with a system where criminals provide better social services than the government? Of the captain's face hardened. You want to know what's deeply wrong? The city spends millions a year on welfare programs. We go to agencies and departments and social workers and administrators, and not one of them organize anything remotely comparable to what Johnson is doing today. He's feeding more people in one day than the city feeds in a month. He's doing it more efficiently, more generously, with more dignity for the recipients than any government program provides. So yeah, something's deeply wrong. But what's wrong isn't Johnson. He's just a criminal doing what criminals do, taking money from people and giving some of it back. What's wrong is that our entire legitimate system has failed so completely that a gangster's charity is the only thing standing between thousands of families and starvation. By mid-afternoon, word had spread through Harlem that Johnson's distribution was particularly generous his year that he was giving out cash payments in addition to food. The line, which had shrunk, suddenly swelled again as families who hadn't planned to come decided to take a chance. Johnson didn't turn anyone away. When he ran out of turkeys, he sent his men to buy more from local butchers, paying full retail price plus generous tips, keeping the distribution operating even as darkness fell and temperatures dropped below freezing. Henry Brooks arrived after the official distribution was supposed to have ended, hobbling on a cane. He'd been a Pullman porter for a decade, before being laid off, and now lived on a pension that barely covered his rent. I heard that Mr. Johnson was giving away food, Brooks said. I know I am late, and if there is nothing, NG left, that's all right. I just thought I'd try. Johnson overheard this, walked over, and personally handed Brooks a turkey that his men had just purchased. Mr. Brooks, you work yours keep. And white people comfortable on their railroad journeys, you deserve better. You take this turkey, and you take this. He handed Brooks an envelope containing cash, and you buy yourself a warm coat for the winter. Don't argue with me. Just take it and stay warm. Brooks tried to protest, but Johnson was already greeting the next person in line. Reverend Dr. William James of a Baptist church showed up not to receive food, but to observe and to struggle with the moral contradictions that Johnson's annual charity created. Reverend James preaches against gambling every Sunday, tells his congregation that policy destroys families, but every Thanksgiving, Reverend James watches Johnson feed more people than his church can feed. Johnson saw Reverend James standing at the edge of the distribution area and walked over, still carrying a half-smoked cigar, his expensive coat now dusted with flour from the bags of food he'd been handling all day. Reverend James, you come to condemn me for running policy, or you come to see if maybe I'm doing something that matters. Johnson's tone wasn't hostile, just tired. Reverend James chose his words carefully. Brother Johnson, I can't endorse where your money comes from. Policy gambling destroys families. I've counseled to many men who gambled away their paychecks, so I can't stand here and say what you do is right. He paused, looking at the families, still receiving food, but I also can't deny that today you're doing God's work. Even if the money comes from the devil's business, you're feeding people who would go hungry otherwise. You're keeping families together, and you're doing it with more grace and more dignity than the government provides. So I'll say this, I hope any day you stop running policy and use your considerable talents for purely legitimate purposes. But until that day comes, I thank you for this, for feeding our people, for remembering that wealth comes obligation. Johnson nodded. Slowly, Reverend, I appreciate that you came. I know what I am. I know I am a criminal. I don't pretend otherwise. But I also know that I was born poor, that my family went hungry more times than I can count, that there were Thanksgivings when we had nothing to eat because my father couldn't find work and nobody gave a damn whether we starved. That stays with you. That makes you understand that poverty isn't some abstract problem you can solve with prayers and good intentions. Poverty is real. It's children crying because their stomachs hurt from hunger. It's old people choosing between medicine and food. I make my money from gambling. Yeah, but I also make sure that nobody in Harlem goes hungry on Thanksgiving if I can prevent it. Maybe that doesn't balance the scales. Maybe I'm still going to hell despite all this. But at least when I get there, I can tell God I tried to do one thing right. The last family received their food. Johnson personally handed them their turkey, shook the father's hand, wished them a happy Thanksgiving, and watched them walk away carrying food that would feed them for a week. Then he stood there for a moment, looking at the empty tables that hours earlier had been covered with thousands of turkeys and worth of other food. Looking at the empty street where thousands of people had waited in the cold, and for just a moment, his face showed something that looked like satisfaction. His financial manager approached with his ledger. That's everyone. Thousands of turkeys distributed. All the canned goods gone. All the produce gone. All the pies given out. We handed out cash payments to hundreds of families. Grand total for the day, the manager said is with precision, treating charitable giving as just another business expense that needed to be accurately recorded. Johnson smiled slightly. I gave back a portion of 1 month's profits to make sure families ate on Thanksgiving. That seems about right. That seems fair. He looked at his manager. Make sure we do this again next year and make it bigger. I want more turkeys next year. I want to feed more people. I want every family in Harlem that needs help to know they can count on Bumpy Johnson on Thanksgiving, that as long as I'm alive and making money, nobody goes hungry on THI's holiday. You understand? The manager nodded. I understand. More turkeys next year. More people. I'll start planning. He paused. You know, people are going to remember this, not the Paul. I see, not the numbers, not the other stuff. They're going to remember that you fed them when nobody else would. That's a legacy worth having. Johnson crushed his cigar under his shoe, pulled his coat tighter against the cold. Legacy. That's a fancy word for what you leave behind when you die. I don't know about legacy. I just know that I've been running Harlem for years. I've made millions of dollars from people's hope that their number will hit, and the least I can do is give some of it back. Not because I'm a good man. I'm not. Not because I'm trying to buy 4G. Venice, I'm not. But because it's right. Because these are my people. Because Harlem made me who I am. And I owe Harlem something for that. So every Thanksgiving, I pay what I owe. Simple as that. He limped into the back of the black Cadillac that had been waiting for him all day. His bodyguards got in behind him. The car pulled away from the curb, driving slowly through streets where people were carrying the food Johnson had given them, where families were having conversations they'd been dreading about how they'd afford Thanksgiving, but that now didn't need to happen because Bumpy Joe Henson had made sure they'd eat. Back at his office, Johnson poured himself a drink, stood at the window looking out at Harlem's lights, and allowed himself a moment of something. Gee, that might have been contentment. Tomorrow, he'd go back to being Harlem's policy king, would collect baits and pay winners, and deal with runners who were stealing, and with competitors who needed to be eliminated. Tomorrow, he'd be the gangster the police wanted to arrest and the criminal that ministers denounced from pulpit. But today, for one day, he'd been something different. O-Day, he'd been the man who made sure thousands of people ate Thanksgiving dinner, and in Harlem, where poverty was crushing and where legitimate institutions provided minimal help, and where being black meant facing discrimination at every turn. That mattered more than all the sermons about morality and all the police investigations into his crimes and all the newspaper editorials condemning gangsters who corrupted communities. Because at the end of the day, the families who received food from Bumpy Johnson didn't care that he was a criminal. They cared that they were going to eat. And that simple fact that feeding people mattered more than moral purity was why Bumpy Johnson would die years later, not in prison and not in a hail of bullets, but in Harlem, mourned by thousands who remembered that he fed them when nobody else would, protected by a community that understood that saints don't survive in Harlem, but that sometimes gangsters do God's work despite themselves.